Hello, and welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's internet show on the most pressing issues impacting transatlantic relations today. My name is Damir Marusic. I'm Senior Fellow at the Council's Europe Center. The European Commission's leaders' meetings have wrapped up, and there's a lot to unpack from the meetings yesterday. I'm joined today by Dave Keating, France 24's Brussels correspondent, and our own Senior Non-Resident Fellow here at the Atlantic Council. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Dave, I guess just to get the conversation going, what, from your perspective, were the main takeaways from the UCO summit? What were some of the key wins and the key roadblocks looking ahead?
Well, there were two big roadblocks that were overcome yesterday. One was there had been this difficulty in adopting this 18 billion euros in aid for Ukraine. First, Hungary was threatening to veto that aid because it was trying to get its funds that had been frozen because of its rule of law violations. They were trying to get the EU to backtrack on that. In the end, they reached a compromise where they would have slightly less funds frozen until they addressed those rule of law concerns. So they thought they had that all wrapped up. And then late Wednesday, Poland came into the veto game as well and said, no, now we want to veto. Their ostensible objection was this linked file, which is about a corporate minimum tax that Poland has never really been a fan of. And at the last minute, even though they had said previously they were okay with what was going to be agreed upon, they had some objections last minute. So that meant that also that Ukraine aid was also being held hostage. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had a video address to the 27 EU leaders yesterday. And without mentioning Poland by name, apparently he was pretty harsh about anyone who was trying to veto the aid. And shortly after Poland relented, they got some guarantees from the Commission that they're going to put forward the second pillar. So they got something. But anyway, that went through. And then also this ninth package of sanctions went through yesterday. So this will be 200 additional people and entities added to the sanctions list. And most importantly, it will forbid the export of drones or drone technology from Europe to Russia or to countries that are supplying Russia with drones, notably Iran. So that went through. That part of it wasn't controversial. The issue was while doing that, they had to tighten some loopholes. Well, not loopholes really. They had to tighten the explanatory nature of previous sanctions rounds, which ports were interpreting as meaning they couldn't transport fertilizer from Russia over to Africa. African countries were saying, look, the EU sanctions are depriving us of food and causing starvation. You need to fix this. The EU was saying, no, there's an exemption for this that should go through. The issue apparently was some of the owners of those fertilizer companies are oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, who ended up being on the sanctions list in previous rounds. And so the ports were saying, we can't touch this. They're on the sanctions list. That was fixed yesterday. There was kind of a back and forth with some of the Eastern EU states that weren't so happy about further exemptions or, benefiting oligarchs' businesses, but that went through. So in terms of the Ukraine war and the Russia situation, those at least were two things that went through. I mean, it's not huge wins because, well, that aid to Ukraine is now very delayed after all this veto brinksmanship, but at least that did go through.
So, it's the coverage of the summit did focus on a lot of these veto points and the brinksmanship that Poland was engaging in. How much is it a legitimate concern to worry about this kind of pressure that Hungary and Poland continue to exert on this decision making? But or how much is this to leverage the American expression? It's just how the sausage is made, and it seems like these real-time negotiations at the highest levels at leaderships just leads itself to this kind of drama that maybe in a normal political system, a more normal sort of state-based political system, it's just what happens in Parliament. Is it overstated, or are we seeing a further crack up of sort of European unity? Is this business as usual, or will this leave scars?
In a way, it's business as usual, and in a way, it's also new. So obviously, the big difference with a national government is no national government that I'm aware of would allow one person in a chamber to veto legislation, right? The Senate in the US has the filibuster, but that's can be overcome with 40 votes. Essentially, that's 40 people blocking it. The veto system, there used to be more files in the EU that could be subject to a veto that needed unanimous approval. Now that's been whittled down over the years to just taxation and foreign policy, and a couple of other kind of issues that impinge on sovereignty. So those are the issues where you can still do this. And these have those two things I just outlined are foreign policy and taxation. So those are the two things where you can exercise this veto. Now, that's nothing new. And actually, there's less veto power now than there used to be. What is new is that countries are kind of shamelessly using this lately to get their own way. And Hungary, particularly, obviously, is using this in a very brazen way. But, Hungary is not the only one. Cyprus used this with Belarus sanctions not too long ago because they wanted an unrelated issue with Turkey resolved. But there are a lot of voices that saying, look, we need to end the veto for all issues, even for these remaining issues. That's something that probably would take another round of treaty reform, which people are still kind of scared of after the Lisbon Treaty experience. There's other people that say, actually, you could end this without having treaty reform. Actually, late last night when the summit was over, a Czech journalist asked all three presidents to respond to this idea that the EU is becoming a vetocracy because of Viktor Orban, and so much time is just spent placating him and trying to get around this ability that he has because of the EU system to veto things. None of them really answered that question convincingly, even though actually one of the people being asked on that podium was Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and she has actually endorsed the idea of ending the veto. That's something that was recommended by this citizens panel that was conducting work earlier this year to make recommendations on how to make the EU function better. They said, get rid of this veto. But of course, the national governments are loath to give away something like that, which is something, especially for small countries, that they like having, even if they don't intend to use it.
It's one of the other stories, and it's comparatively a minor one. Zelensky addressed the meeting, and then at the same time, the decision was made to give the green light to Bosnia for getting full membership. When I was watching that seemed to me like a very concerted effort by the Europeans to show that enlargement is still alive, and that there's real momentum. They granted this to Ukraine, and now they're granting it to Bosnia. At the same time, they had approved Croatia both joining the Euro and the Schengen zone. But the problem, of course, is what you're getting at here is that both, I believe, President Macron for a while has been saying this, but now Chancellor Scholz has as well been saying it, that prerequisite for further enlargement, for any meaningful further enlargement, is in fact the kind of reforms that would entail qualified majority voting and getting rid of the veto. Do you think? And what was striking to me about watching Poland and Hungary do this is, in recent trips to Poland and talking about EU enlargement, when we bring up QMV, from civil society to government, that would say, absolutely not, it's just not happening. Do you have a sense then, you said that there's still a lot of worry about this. Is there a way forward around this? You mentioned there's ways to get around these blockages. Do you have a sense in your reporting that there's movement on that there could be movement on that?
Well, there's this passerelle clause that they can use to do it without treaty change. The issue is, to use that, you would need unanimous approval. So anyone wanting to use a veto would veto that. Treaty change also requires unanimous approval, but that's a little different because that actually goes to parliaments. So it's not actually a decision for the leader in the council, and it would be part of a package of overall reform. So it might be a little harder for countries to say no to that. There would be more public attention around it. It would be going to national parliaments. So actually, even though both things technically require unanimous approval, the treaty change route is a bit easier. And also you see when a country says no to treaty change, and it's the only country that's saying no, that usually doesn't work out, such as Ireland with the Lisbon Treaty. They had some kind of cosmetic changes to the treaty, and then Ireland voted again and said yes. We are actually overdue for treaty change. Treaty change in the EU usually comes at least once a decade, often more frequently. And the last treaty change was 2008 with the Lisbon Treaty, which was actually overdue from something that had started in 2004. So it's time for treaty change as in the EU's usual calendar. But of course, that experience with the Lisbon Treaty, because that was originally the EU constitution, which was rejected in referendums by Dutch and French voters in 2005. So EU governments are still quite traumatized by that experience. Now, that was a very different time. Levels of approval for the EU back then were much lower than they are now. Actually, the levels of Euroscepticism across the Union are much lower now than they were back then in 2004, 2005. And also people are a little more attuned, a little more educated on the issues than they were then. So I don't think that the governments have to worry about this so much, but clearly they do. Clearly this is something, a Pandora's box they're afraid to open. And I haven't heard anyone in the council strongly endorse treaty change, even though everyone in every other institution says it's time.
So, the one story that one issue that was obviously not on the agenda but has just dominated the news is the Qatar corruption scandal with the European Parliament. You noted just now that trust in the EU's, the Euroscepticism is ebbing at this point. But at the same time, you saw, the usual suspects, especially Viktor Orban, saying "drain the swamp," saying, trying to drum up that this is a deeply corrupt institution. Do you think that this scandal will have legs and sort of again leave scars and maybe change perceptions about Europeans about what's happening in Brussels, or is it just another one of these things that, unfortunate, corruption happens, it'll get cleaned up and it'll be forgotten?
I think it really depends. There are so many rumors swirling around Brussels this week about who's next, what's next. Particularly we're watching for that. There's kind of a feeling now that actually this Qatar stuff might have come out in the course of another investigation about Morocco trying to buy influence. That's the kind of beat from the street. But right now we don't know. The Belgian authorities are being pretty tight-lipped. If things just remain as they are now, look, it's only one MEP that was arrested. The details are very lurid about these, suitcases full of cash, and it's a very bad look. But in the end, if this is all it is, then there really isn't any reason why the EU as a whole should have its credibility challenged, or even the European Parliament as a whole. But if this expands to other MEPs in the European Parliament, which I would say generally there is a feeling that it probably will, and probably MEPs from other parties, not just the centre-left S&D group, it depends then, is this a problem just for the Parliament, or is this a problem for the EU as a whole? Certainly the Commission and the Council, the past days have been saying, well, this has nothing to do with us, that's the European Parliament, you'll have to ask them. I applaud Roberta Metsola, the Parliament President, for getting to grips with this. That's what we heard from the leaders yesterday, and none of them want to talk about the prospect that this could have also spread to their own institutions. The thing is, if there was all of this cash rolling around in Brussels to try to buy influence for foreign countries, it's hard to believe it would have only stuck to the European Parliament. It is the least powerful institution, and it's also actually the most transparent. The Council is completely opaque. We have no idea what happens inside the Council. They don't have to declare any meetings. So it's kind of hard to believe that this wouldn't, if it is as big as is being suggested, and it does grow, I can't imagine it stays only in the Parliament. And so that may be a mistake by the Council, by the leaders. We saw kind of a difference there actually when they were coming in yesterday. They all kind of didn't want to talk about this. That's for the European Parliament, never heard of it. And by the end, at their closing press conferences, I heard that there was a robust discussion started by the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, yesterday, who said, look, guys, this is not good that we're ignoring this. We are the EU. And you can come in here in Brussels and pretend that you're just parachuting in and all this has nothing to do with you. But we are sitting here in an EU institution, and there is a possibility that this is going to extend into our institution. We can't just kind of plug our ears and hope this goes away. I think that did land a bit with other leaders, because then at the closing press conferences, I saw particularly with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who went into the summit really saying this has nothing to do with me, coming out, expressing more concern. So we'll see. I think the big question, does it expand, and does it expand to other institutions?
And then, the other sort of Europe subject that preceded this and did occupy some time was this question of European competitiveness and the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. We've been hearing a lot about that. Walk us through, I guess, the discussions at UCO on that, and give us a sense of how big of a deal this is. Is it political? Is it political posturing that necessarily against has to happen, or is there real bad blood developing transatlantically here? And do you think there'll be an impact to transatlantic relations and trade negotiations?
Yeah, it's not political posturing. There is real bad blood. And actually, the leaders are getting leaned on by European businesses. So this isn't something they're drumming up. Look, I mean, it's in no one's political interest right now to be picking a fight with the US. And everyone's being very blunt about that as they were coming in yesterday saying, we don't want a trade war, you know, given that Europe depends on the United States for its security and there is currently a war on European soil. It's not in anyone's political interest to be talking about, to be saber rattling with the US. But they really, really believe that the provisions in the IRA, the Buy American provisions, the subsidizing of American businesses for green technology, that is a kind of existential threat to European businesses, particularly while they are suffering under these energy prices and the American companies are not. Now, all of the discussion yesterday was how to de-escalate this, not how to escalate this. So the number one thing they want is the Biden administration and the Congress to make adjustments to the IRA to address their concerns. But I can't see that happening, especially with a Republican Congress coming in just a matter of weeks. And I don't think they realistically see that happening either. So what they're talking about now is this kind of mix of changing state aid rules to allow EU countries to more directly subsidize their own companies, and this idea for a European sovereignty fund. The reason why it has to be both is because if you change state aid rules to make it easier for countries to subsidize their companies, that benefits the big rich countries. But then that's not a level playing field within Europe for these smaller countries who don't have all this money to pump into their own companies. So they would have to be compensated with some kind of fund at EU level, which may come from joint borrowing. Germany would like nothing more than to be able to relax EU state aid rules and pump money into its companies. It's got the money. The issue is then Germany would probably have to say yes to more joint borrowing for some kind of European sovereignty fund that helps the less well-off countries. And of course, Germany classically does not want that ever. To have Eurobonds, to have shared debt. So we'll see. That was where the discussion was going yesterday. The Commission is supposed to come out with a proposal in January, and they want something adopted by March, by the March European Council. And again, that they keep saying, well, if the US backs off, then we won't need to do this. But there's really no prospect of the IRA being changed in a way that will address the Europeans' concerns.
And then I guess final question on energy. There's still some discussion that needs to happen around gas and the way they're approaching Russia, and I think pricing caps. What was the mood generally? What does that look like going ahead? And was there much discussion about what the year ahead looks like for Europe? Because they managed to get through and likely will get through this winter well. But is there a sense of apprehension about what's to come still?
There's less apprehension than there was a couple months ago. I mean, the gas storage levels are very high. Europe is looking like it's going to be okay this winter. The concern is, of course, next winter, because they could fill that gas storage now this year, but next year that's going to be much more difficult. And there's real concern about this package of energy measures that's now been stalled by this disagreement over the gas price cap, this mechanism that 16 EU countries want and the rest of the EU countries very much do not want. The idea is that you would cap the price that European countries buy liquefied natural gas in the global market. And the problem that Germany, Denmark, Norway, the more free market countries have brought up, which is a legitimate concern, is that the LNG will just go to other countries. It'll go to Japan, it'll go elsewhere, who are willing to pay more than the EU's cap. They're talking about a dynamic cap so that the cap would always be just a little more than Japan is willing to pay. Experts I've talked to say that that's nonsense. You don't know what Japan's paying. It's a private contract. So that issue is still frozen. They luckily didn't go into that yesterday. There was a gentleman's agreement. Let's not talk about the gas price cap because it totally hijacked the last council summit in October. And so they left that for energy ministers who are meeting on Monday to try again. They already tried on Tuesday to reach a deal with that. They failed. They've scheduled another meeting on Monday. They did put into the conclusions yesterday that will be the final negotiation. They will finalize the text. I mean, that Charles Michel was trying to say that meant something at the final press conference. It doesn't mean if they don't come to an agreement, they don't come to an agreement. The key thing to watch is whether those 16 countries will give up on blocking the rest of that package. So that's a whole bunch of other things, including joint gas purchasing, solidarity measures that's actually really needed urgently. The 16 countries are holding that back, using it as leverage, saying we're not going to approve this whole package until you give us our gas price cap. But they may get nervous on the 19th, on Monday, if they still end up with no agreement. So do they say, okay, we're giving in, let's approve the rest of the package and save the gas price cap for later? But in talking to those governments, they've told me candidly, look, if we do that, there's never going to be a gas price cap. It's our only leverage right now. So that Monday's going to be a very interesting day to watch for that Energy Council.
Dave Keating, thank you so much for this wonderful tour of inside the sausage factory.
Glad to be here.